these 5 stitches that you need to know for crocheting is what projects should you start with and what might be a little bit too overwhelming. This is what's going to take you away from the beginner zone. Hello all, welcome to or back to my channel. My name is Gabrielle and I've been crocheting for about 3 years now. I was a fellow YouTube crochet learner, so I decided that I thought I would make a beginner series which would go over all the materials you need, all the materials you think you need that you actually don't, all of the skills that you need, and basically just de-overwhelm the entire crochet learning process. And then I'm going to follow up this video with more in-detail videos about each of the skills I list here, and then do some supporting videos about some good beginner projects for you guys. And let me know in the comments what other videos that you guys want me to do or would be helpful for you in your crochet journey. Check out my video, my top 10 crochet tips for beginners. I'll include it in this series on my YouTube page. Just go click playlists and find my beginner playlist for you guys. The first thing I'll be talking about is the materials that you're going to need for crocheting. And here I'll list them all for you, and then I'm going to go into more detail about each specific thing. So for crochet hooks, it is, cost-wise to just get a pack of hooks that have a few different sizes, but if you're trying to get just one hook to start, I'd recommend the size 4.5 millimeter. It's my favorite crochet hook size. I basically make almost all my projects with it. It's good for almost all of the yarns you can find in a Joann's or a Michael's or a standard yarn store. Next, let's just go over scissors. You definitely need some scissors. This is good for when you finish a project and you need to cut it off, or you need to change colors, or whatever is going on. You need scissors. Alright, so next you're going to need some yarn. I think a lot of people get overwhelmed with which hook size or which yarn sizes they need. Really, you can just use whatever hook size you want, whatever yarn size you want. The bigger your hook, the looser the stitches. And the smaller your hook, the tighter the stitches. Now with the yarn, the thicker the yarn, the tighter the stitches, and the thinner the yarn, the looser the stitches. So if you want, just the standard tightness, that's why a lot of the yarn labels will show on it like what hook size they recommend. But say you wanted to make like a mesh pullover thing, you want it to be loose and baggy and kind of like more flowy, not as bulky, then you might actually want to do a different size hook than what's recommended. The point in me saying this is just don't get too overwhelmed about getting the perfect hook size and the perfect yarn size, because really that's just a suggestion and you can do whatever you feel like. So no worries. So for the yarns, I would recommend just starting off with your basic acrylic cheap yarn at the store, or maybe go thrifting, find some yarn there. You can get the most expensive yarns out there that are really high quality, really sustainable, good for the earth if you feel like it. But a lot of us don't have that budget, and so acrylic yarn will definitely work out fine. So the last thing that I think that you definitely need as a beginner is a yarn needle. This is basically, after you cut off of your project, you need to thread the thread that you just cut off through your work so that it's not showing. So it looks all finished and neat and tidy. This is really hard to do without a yarn needle. If you're making stuffed animals, you can definitely do that with like just pulling thread into the stuffed animal body, and you don't really need a yarn needle in that case. But then if you're making stuffed animals, you need a yarn needle to sew the pieces together. So basically you should just get a yarn needle or 2 or 3 in case you lose one. Okay, so next are the materials that you might think that you need that you don't need. So here are stitch markers. You might be like, what are stitch markers? These are basically so you don't lose count or where your row started and began, especially when you're doing something with circles and you just keep going at the spiral but you don't know where your row started or stopped. Stitch markers is just something you insert into a stitch, and that when you come back to the stitch, you know that that was the start of the row and you can replace it onto the next row. Don't worry about the specifics of this. You're just a beginner crocheter, that you won't be needing stitch markers for a little bit. And even when you do, you don't necessarily have to go and spend $6 on a pack of stitch markers, because you can also just use safety pins. You can use your earring, you can use literally another piece of yarn. So stitch markers is just anything that you can put into a stitch. So if you're on a low budget, don't worry about going and buying stitch markers. I actually only have stitch markers because they came in a package of yarn that I ordered online, and I didn't use them for literally 2.5 years. But feel free to go and get yourself some fun stitch markers if you do want them, of course. Another item that you might need later on, but definitely don't as a beginner, is stuffing. I have a huge bag of stuffing in here. This has started when I started making some stuffed animal type items, but that's definitely not a beginner project in my opinion, because you need to use a metric circle, which is kind of an advanced skill, as well as sewing and getting everything in the right order. Some beginner projects, I'll go into them a little bit later in this video, but they're gonna be stuff that stick to like squares and rectangles, and usually not stuffing. I guess if you're making a pillow, that might be a good beginner project. You might need some stuffing for that. But you can use a lot of things for stuffing as well. So I know a lot of you guys are probably upcyclers. If you ever have extra scrap fabric in your house, you can just stuff that into a pillow. You can stuff extra scrap yarn into your little amigurumi thing. For example, my little Gary the snail, I could just stuff little extra yarns in here. This was one of my beginner projects. You can tell I was like, didn't really know what I was doing when I was trying to make it green. I've got a lot better at that, don't worry. And let me know in the comments if you guys have any other ideas for stuff that you thought that you needed when you were a beginner crocheter that you actually don't need, or is a little bit unnecessary, or if you're trying to save some money. Next is a breakdown of all the skills that you're gonna need as a beginner crocheter. And when I say like all the skills you're gonna need, you actually don't need to know that many. So the 3 skills I'd recommend that you focus on learning is gonna be how to make a slip knot, how to do a chain, and of course, how to single crochet. Something that you're gonna learn while you're learning these is how to see what a stitch looks like, how to see where you go in with your hook. These are all a lot of the troubles the beginners have when they're learning these stitches. So before you really focus on any huge projects or anything, you just might want to get comfortable being able to count how many chains you have, being able to identify where to put your hook next. So learning how to make a slip knot, how to chain, and how to make all of your chains look like they're consistently like the same size, as well as how to make single crochets into those chains, is going to be something that's really important and that's going to help make all of your projects look coherent. So those 3 skills is something you should really focus on as a beginner. And next I'll be going over the skills that you should consider learning as you are expanding your crochet beyond those 3. So definitely start with those 3 things, and as you're making more and more projects, these next skills are going to come really in handy. So once you're comfortable learning how to make a square with just single crochets, let's go further into learning the next stitches. So there's basically 5 foundation stitches you should know in crochet. And those include the slip stitch, the single crochet, the half double crochet, the double crochet, and the treble crochet. These are all the stitches that you're going to need to know. These are all the stitches that I've basically used in every single project I've had. And then any other stitches you see are usually just combinations of these stitches. What these stitches are, they're not really that different from each other. Okay, so the only difference between these 5 stitches that you need to know for crocheting is how many times you're yarning over before you go into the stitch, and how many loops you're pulling through when you come out of the stitch. And that's the only difference. So if you know how to yarn over and you know how to go into a stitch and yarn over and pull through that stitch, you're going to be just fine and learning the rest of these stitches. Where it gets overwhelming is when you're trying to memorize what name goes with what stitch and when you need these all stitches. So it can get a little bit confusing, and all of that knowledge will come as you just crochet more and more. So definitely don't worry about learning the specific name for each of the stitches. Remember, if you're watching a YouTube tutorial and they say 5 half double crochet into this stitch, all you have to do is slow down the video, go to settings, playback speed, slow it down to like 0.5 speed, and just see, what's a half double crochet? Oh, they yarn over once, then they went to the stitch. Oh, I kind of remember this one. Yarn over, pull out, then they're going through 3 loops. You can just slow down the video and you can just see what they're doing. You don't necessarily have to open up a whole other page and then go to YouTube and type in half double crochet tutorial, because that's unnecessary. All that it is just seeing how many times you yarn over, how many times you pull through, and how many loops you are pulling through. Okay, so now that we've got the 5 stitches that you're gonna need to know after you're comfortable with chaining and making single crochets, let's go to some other skills that beginners will eventually be learning as they are expanding their crochet practice. So after you're comfortable with everything that we've already talked about so far, we're gonna start moving on to circles, increases, decreases, magic circles, changing colors, and some ribbing slash going into back loops or front loops only. I know that I just said a lot of stuff you probably never heard of before, but if you're ever making like a bucket hat, or you're making a granny square, or you're making anything where you start out, you have a circle. This is also going to happen with amigurumi, stuffed animal type things. You're going to have to make, it's basically a slip knot that you haven't pulled tight. And why this is a skill that a lot of beginners struggle with is because you have to like hold a bunch of strands together so it doesn't like all unravel at once while trying to crochet. So of course that can be a little bit difficult and it can take, you know, a few minutes, maybe an hour to really get the hang of it, but you'll need to learn how to make a magic circle. This is for any circle project. Next, how to work into a magic circle. So basically, instead of like making stitches into a stitch, with a magic circle, you're going into a circle of thread and then making stitches on it, and then you pull the circle tight, so then you have stitches that are in the form of a circle instead of along the top of a chain that's like on a line. So that is what a magic circle is, and it's so helpful and it gets so fun and easy and everything after you just practice a little bit. So this is something I'd recommend after you're comfortable with everything that we've already talked about. Next, if you're working in circles, you're probably going to be making use of that slip stitch that we talked about before, as well as changing colors. So one of my most popular tutorials is the cow bucket hat tutorial. And that basically you have to change colors a lot because every time you're going on a row and you want to change it to black to make a spot on the cow, you have to change colors. It can be something that seems a little bit daunting for beginners, but all you're doing is instead of yarning over and pulling through all the loops on your hook with the color that you're already working with, you're just going to use your other strand of yarn and pull that through. But this is a skill that a lot of beginners may want to learn as they're expanding the practice. Again, this is not something to worry about in the very beginning, but just for this video, which goes over basically all the skills necessary that a lot of crocheters know, this is something that you can start incorporating as your projects get a little bit more advanced. Okay, so after you make your few beginner projects, you're probably going to encounter the increase and the decrease and some ribbing. So an increase is just how it sounds. It means you're increasing the size of your project. So for the bucket hat, if you're starting out with just a little circle, of course your head gets a lot bigger. So you have to add stitches in each row, which make it get a lot bigger. So an increase is basically where you're putting 2 stitches into the next stitch instead of 1 stitch. So this is just going to increase the number of stitches you have in the next row that you're working on. And a decrease is just the opposite. Say you're making something you want to fit snugly around your waist, or you made something around your chest and then you want to fit along your abdomen, you're going to need a decrease. So a decrease is basically where you go into 2 stitches and just make 1 stitch from it. So this is going to decrease the number of stitches you have in that row total. And then lastly, a skill that you're going to need if you're making a sweater, or maybe if you're making a hat and you want to have like a little ribbing rim, is how to do ribbing. A lot of tutorials will go over this if you're watching a tutorial for how to make a sweater, but ribbing is basically where you're going in only the back loops, and every time you turn you're only going to back loops. This makes it look like this. So I hope this breakdown of all the skills you might need is helpful, and remember, just slowly add in and incorporate the stitches, or come to my playlist for beginners whenever you are encountering something in a tutorial that you're unfamiliar with. You might find it in my beginner series, as this is all the skills I can think of that I use ever. So lastly, let's talk about some projects now that you have all of this knowledge for the materials that you need, the skills that you need. Let's go over what projects should you start with and what might be a little bit too overwhelming. So first, like I recommended when I was going over some of the skills that you'll need, I would start with making something that is rectangular or square. Let's not get all worked up into the magic circles and changing colors and something too complicated. Additionally, so start with something that's rectangular or square in shape, and start with something that's small that you can finish in a day or 2 or 3. You want to do something that you can just practice some skills and then move on to something you really do want to make. Start with small projects that make you feel like, oh, gaining confidence, getting used to how crocheting feels and how holding the hook works and getting your tension correct. And then you can work on some bigger projects that take more time. Some good projects might be headbands, scrunchies, bookmarks. Beanies are actually pretty good. Leg warmers, I have a tutorial up on my page for leg warmers. Arm struggies and a skirt would also be good. Okay, so after you've done a few beginner projects out there, really you can also look up some tutorials that are like for some flowers. A lot of people start with granny squares, but I'm actually going to recommend that for this next round of projects. So after you've done a good few beginner projects, maybe you're just making some squares. I actually just recommend just make a bunch of squares, that's fine too. And then you can just unravel them and use the yarn for the project you actually want to make. So after you've practiced the 5 different types of stitches that there are out there and you're comfortable making slip knots and chains, go ahead, try making some granny squares. Do start out with a magic circle. It's good to learn how to work into circles, and also you can change colors using granny squares. You use increases to make each part of the square bigger. Granny squares are actually really good for incorporating a lot of the more advanced skills that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Some other good projects for you are bucket hats. I have a few up on my channel, how to make some bucket hats. Steering wheel covers are good, that'll get you doing some sewing. Blankets, bags, and coasters. There's a lot of fun coasters I've been seeing on TikTok lately, and this is one that I made for my Mother's Day gift here. I'm actually obsessed with it. So these are all some good beginner crochet projects that allow you to bring in those other skills that I was talking about, including increases and decreases. Lastly, this is what's going to take you away from the beginner zone, designing your own patterns. This is really where you know that you're getting more advanced. When you think of an idea that you want to crochet, or you see like this shirt or this top, but it's made out of regular cloth and you want to figure out how to crochet it, crocheting like for your own body size and figuring all that out, that's pretty advanced. So if you can do that already, you're well on your way. Thank you guys all for sticking around. Make sure to subscribe for more crochet content, more crochet tips, and also just to learn more about my life.